Welcome back to DIY My Way and part 2 of my do-it-yourself backhoe thumb project. If you arrived here without watching part 1, then I really recommend you watch part 1 first because there's a lot of information in there that makes the rest of this project make sense in this episode. In part 1, I covered my choice of a third function valve kit, which was from Summit Hydraulics. I also covered how I went about taking the measurements to determine the size of cylinder that I needed, as well as my process for choosing the cylinder that I did. And then I test fit the cylinder to make sure it was going to work while I still had time to return it if I had miscalculated. So in part 2, I'll cover how I chose to tap into the hydraulic system, my choice of a third function valve, and also some other options beside the third function valve that, depending on how your tractor is set up, might be a cheaper and quicker alternative for you. I also cover running the boom hoses, assembling the third function valve, determining where to place it on the backhoe, and then plumbing that up as well. There are a number of ways to tap into your tractor hydraulics to power a backhoe thumb. If you have hydraulic remotes on the back of your tractor, you can make use of them to operate the thumb, provided you can reach the remote valve control from the backhoe seat. That could be a problem if you have a cab on your tractor like this one. Also, this requires 2 more hose connections to your backhoe. To keep things as simple as possible, I decided to tap into the Power Beyond loop that's used to power the backhoe, so no extra hydraulic connections are needed, and I'll use a third function kit for the thumb control. The Summit Universal Third Function Kit is designed to work with the Power Beyond loop and is typically fed from the front-end loader valve Power Beyond port to the pump or P port to operate an implement such as a grapple from the A and B ports. The loop continues from the tank or T port to power the 3-point, remote valve, or a backhoe before ending back in the hydraulic tank. But that grapple connected to the A and B ports could just as easily be a backhoe thumb, and that's my plan except for one change. I'll put the third function valve after the backhoe and before the 3-point lift and tank. The beauty of the Power Beyond loop is that the order of the valves in the loop typically doesn't matter. You'll see why I chose this position in the loop later. Here's another diagram of my configuration that shows the bucket cylinder operates normally with the bucket spool valve, and the thumb cylinder operates through the third function solenoid valve, which is controlled with the buttons on the joystick knob, which will replace the knob on the dipper stick and bucket control lever. This way both cylinders can operate independently of each other. This is what I call the deluxe way of controlling a hydraulic thumb, but there are some simpler, less expensive ways you might want to consider. For instance, I mentioned using existing rear remotes where the bucket cylinder operates normally with the bucket spool valve and the thumb cylinder is operated using one of the rear remotes. The cylinders work fully independent of each other, but you have to be able to comfortably reach the remote spool valve from the seat of the backhoe. This is the simplest and probably the least expensive option. Another approach I've seen online is to insert T-fittings in the bucket cylinder lines and use a normally closed solenoid valve controlled by a normally open switch, or it could be a toggle switch. With the switch open, the valve is closed and no hydraulic fluid can flow through the thumb in either direction, so it is locked in whatever position it happens to be in, and only the bucket cylinder moves when you move the bucket spool valve. When the switch is closed, the valve opens, allowing hydraulic fluid to flow into both cylinders, so they operate at the same time, opening or closing together when you move the bucket spool valve. This option is also fairly simple and inexpensive, but you lack independent control of the thumb and bucket. Finally, you can use a diverter solenoid valve to switch the flow of hydraulic fluid from the bucket cylinder to the thumb cylinder. So when the switch is open, the bucket cylinder works normally, and the thumb cylinder is locked in position. Close the switch and the bucket cylinder is locked in place while you control the thumb cylinder with the bucket control spool valve. You can control one cylinder or the other, but not both cylinders at the same time. But since I wanted fully independent and simultaneous operation of the cylinders, I went with a third function valve design. But enough about all that technical stuff. Let's plumb up some hydraulics. First, I determined the length of the boom hoses by measuring the distance from where I'll mount some bulkhead fittings, just like these that connect to the bucket cylinder, to underneath the backhoe seat where the third function valve will be located. I plan to follow the Kubota design and run shorter hoses from the bulkhead fitting to the thumb cylinder ports. The reason for this is that those last few feet of hose are much more likely to get damaged by digging than the longer hoses running inside the hollow backhoe boom, and I'd rather have to replace a short section of hose than to rerun the entire hose if one gets damaged. Turns out 8 feet will be good and leave wiggle and flex room, so I'll need 2 8-foot hoses. To reach the extend port on the cylinder from the bulkhead fittings will take a 3-foot hose, and to reach the retract port will take a 4-foot hose. I ordered the hoses from Summit Hydraulics along with the kit. When choosing your hydraulic hoses, a word of advice, pay attention to the diameter of the hose, not just the hose fitting size, because when I ordered the hoses from Summit, I ordered the 3/8 inch connectors that I needed, but what I didn't pay attention to was the actual outside diameter of the hoses. The factory back hoses are probably a 1/2 inch in outside max, and these are about 3/4 of an inch. Now that did make a difference in a few tight places. It all fit, but it was a little snugger than I would like. We interrupt this program to bring you this special subliminal message. We now return you to your regularly scheduled program. First thing I'm going to do is run the longest segments of my hydraulic hoses down through the boom and to the undercarriage of the backhoe. And to make it a little easier to do, I'm going to extend the boom out on the backhoe. Before feeding the hoses through the boom, I want to put a protective sleeve around them, similar to what's already on the tractor. I found this 25-foot roll of 1-inch ID nylon protective sleeve on Amazon. Once I had it pulled over the length of the hose, I cut it cleanly with a pair of scissors, then used a lighter to melt the end to prevent it from fraying. I do the same for the other hose. For both hoses, I pull the sleeve past the hose connector, fold it back, and zip tie it, and you'll see why in a moment. Here's a closer look at the hose end. I'm about to push this hose through a bunch of dirt and grease, and I want to keep that hose connection as clean as possible during the installation. I feed the hoses into the opening under the dipper stick cylinder and look for the ends to appear at the bottom opening of the boom. Once I see them, I pull a few inches of slack through. I don't yet know which way I'll route them to the area under the seat, so I'll just pull them both to one side for now. I take the backhoe off the tractor and onto the dolly to be ready for the next plumbing steps. The third function valve requires some assembly, and they have no instructions for how to do it. Actually, while the paper instructions included in the kit do not, the downloadable instructions for the kit do cover it, but it's not as detailed as I think it should be, so pay attention to the tips I'm about to give you. But it's not hard to figure out if you look at their diagrams. You have first the solenoid valve itself and the actual connection block here, the two parts. And there's a protective cover on here that comes off, theoretically speaking. Under here you'll see there are 4 O-rings embedded right here. I'm going to give those a little bit of lubrication with hydro oil before we marry it up to this piece here. right. The valve is marked with P on this side and BTA on that side, and with the P port and T port here, meaning pump and tank, and the A and B here, you want it oriented this way, where the summit sits like this, as you see in the diagram. It comes with 4 bolts to assemble it. Requires a 5/32 Allen wrench to screw it down, and the recommended torque for this screw, which by the way is a number 10 by 24 thread, is 22 inch-pounds. Before I get any of them tight, make sure I get them all started. And I wish I could do 22 inch-pounds, but I have no way to put a wrench on this, so I'm just going to tighten it down real good. But I'm going to go diagonally, tighten each one a little bit, and just go back and forth a few times. I'm now thinking I might have been wise to use a little Loctite blue. Looks pretty good. Since it's going to take me a while to figure out how to orient everything in here, I put some plastic caps borrowed from other fittings on here to keep any contaminants out of the connection block. The easiest way I can figure to connect this up is to get into the Power Beyond loop here on the tank return coming back from the backhoe, which means that goes into the pump port. It's easy to get confused. It's not tank to tank. If that's going to the tank, then that goes into the pump here, and the tank connection will go here. So the first thing I want to do is to remove these bolts so that this can be loose, because this connection is going to be coming directly off of one of these ports now, and then this connection will be screwed into the pump port here, and this one to the tank. First, I removed the tank hose from the mounted fitting assembly. Then remove the fitting assembly. I believe I've got the perfect solution here. And it's different than I originally envisioned, but I thought that might happen. And that is to mount it like so. Tap some screws here. I might even weld a little piece of plate across the back there so that I can screw into that as well. And then the third function solenoid valve goes here. My tank connection will come out here at possibly with a 45 or a 90. I'll have to see which works best. And then from the tank return from the backhoe will go in here, and A and B on this side. I think that's going to be awesome. It turns out I had to take the solenoid valve off the connection block to be able to screw on the fittings. I add some hydraulic oil to the O-ring, then wipe excess off the threads. The connection block accepts O-ring Boss fittings, which are now my favorite kind. These fittings have a jam nut, washer, and O-ring, and are very easy to install. Screw it on until fully seated, then back it off to the orientation I want. Then all I have to do is tighten the jam nut until the washer is flush with the block. The quick connect coupler is threaded for a 1/2 inch ORB fitting, so I use a straight 1.5 inch male ORB to 1/2 inch male GIC connector, which were included with the kit. Because this is a straight fitting, there's no need for a jam nut or washer. It just has the O-ring. I tighten it until the fitting nut is flush with the coupler and the O-ring disappears. Now I make my first JIC connection, threading it on hand tight. Then I make a mark on the 2 nut flats. Half-inch JIC connectors require tightening to 1 1/4 to 1 3/4 nut flats, so I'll go for 1 1/2. But ended up at about 1 1/4, so that will do. Then I reattach the solenoid valve to the block, this time using some Loctite glue. After drilling a couple of 5/16 inch holes in the mounting plate, I use my automatic center punch to make divots where I'll drill into the bottom of the backhoe seat frame, which is about 3/16 inches thick. Then drill 2 13/32 holes. I put a dab of cutting oil on the bit first, by the way. And tap them for 1/4 by 20 thread screws. I test fit the screws before attaching to the mounting plate. At last, I can attach the third function valve. It's time to plumb this thing up. First, I connect the backhoe tank return line to the pump or P-port on the connection block. It's in a pretty tight space, but manageable. This connection and the remaining ones are 3/8 inch JIC connections, and the same tightening rule applies as the 1/2 inch JIC connections. Now I cut back the protective sleeve I had over one of the 8-foot hoses. It doesn't matter which hose goes to which of the A and B ports from an operational standpoint, and you'll see why later. I just picked based on which hose most easily reaches the fitting. I tighten to spec. Then secure the protective sleeve to the hose with a zip tie. Same song, second verse for the other hose. I decided to add some split washers to the mounting screws to ensure they don't come loose. To mount the bulkhead fittings, I need a couple of short pieces of angle iron, but didn't have the right size I wanted, so I decided to make the angle iron out of some square tubing I had on hand. I've already drilled a 9/16 inch hole all the way through the tubing. Now I just needed to turn it into angle iron. I established a straight cut with the top of the vise as a guide. Then finished the cut with the tubing in an upright position. And the same thing for the opposite side. Then I used my chop saw to turn the tubing into 2 pieces of angle iron. There's one. And there's 2. I round off the edges as a finishing touch. Next, I moved the dipper stick cylinder out of the way. The one important thing I forgot to do, which I should have done, is wrapped the exposed cylinder rod with tape or cloth to protect it from welding spatter. I removed the paint from the area where the bulkhead mounts will be welded. Now the fun part. I brushed the slag off the welds. Clean them with paint thinner. Then paint it with a couple of coats of Kubota orange after the primer has dried. After the paint is dried, I install one of the 3/8 inch JIC bulkhead fittings. Then connect one of the boom hoses. And tighten to spec. I repeat for the other side. Well, this video is getting a little long, so it looks like it'd be best if I do a part 3 to finish things up. And in part 3, I'll weld up the spacers and gussets to the backhoe thumb, mount the cylinder, connect the short hoses, do an initial operation test, wire up all electrical connections, and then do field testing of the thumb. So stay tuned.